Well, there's a lot of material in Chapter 2, Section 1A, and it's just tough to figure out how to break this thing up. The last video was over 20 minutes, and this one is going to be as well, too. I wish that the author had broken this up in littler pieces to where there was much more logical breaks in the teaching. But we'll just jump right into it. This is pages 42 through 48 in our textbook. It is the last half of the legal kinds of things. Remember in the last video we talked about specific laws. This time we're going to get into interpretations of those laws and legal processes, both from the employer standpoint and from the employee standpoint. So for example, there's an issue. What we're going to explore in this particular series of this particular video is, what do you as an employee do if you think that the company's doing something wrong? Then what does the company do in response to what you did? So we'll start with an idea of discrimination. You probably learned about discrimination in your business communications and in other classes. Discrimination, very simply, is treating people differently based on some characteristic that they really don't necessarily have any control over. For example, your religion you might have some control over, but I am Baptist because my parents were Baptist, basically. Race, you don't have a control over. I'm Caucasian because my parents were Caucasian. Age, I have no control over because I was born when I was born. So discrimination would be a setting where somebody treats me differently than they treat somebody else because I'm Caucasian, because I'm 57 years old. Somebody treats somebody in downtown Detroit differently than other people because that person is African American, whatever. So understand, discrimination is different from stereotyping or things like that, because some classifications of this concept are looking at people differently, where discrimination goes a step farther and actually does something about it. It's how we treat people, and discrimination is treating people differently because of those classifications. We talked about classifications, broad terms, protected classifications, protected groups. So let's talk about discrimination in terms of how we're treating people. There's two broad categories of discrimination. One is called disparate treatment, and the other is called disparate impact. It's not desperate like the old Desperate Housewives TV show. Disparate, D-I-S-P-A-R-A-T-E, disparate, meaning different, treatment, or disparate impact. The difference here is that disparate treatment is intentional. It is predetermined. It is almost code of processes. Disparate treatment says, I am going to treat you differently every single time because that's the way we do it. Because you're female, you're not going to get the same consideration. It is a conscious decision that we've made. We think that we're legitimate in making that, but you need to know that if you're in a wheelchair, we're going to give you the same answer as the last person we gave in a wheelchair. It doesn't depend. Because you're in a wheelchair, the answer is no. Disparate impact is a situation where we don't have a rule about you being a female, about you being African American, about you being transgender, but the answer is going to end up being no because of other things that impact your category more than they impact other categories. So the biggest difference between disparate treatment and disparate impact is that the disparate treatment is intentional, the disparate impact is not intentional but ends up happening anyway. So a great example of disparate impact is that I run a firehouse, and I've got all these firemen, firewomen, whatever, and it comes time to promote somebody to captain, and I have a test that I give to promote people, and the test involves putting on a 70-pound backpack, climbing stairs very quickly, going through a small window, getting a child, putting them over your back and carrying them back down. And that seems like a legitimate test because that's what captains have to do on a regular basis. Well, that's harder for a small person to do. It's harder for a female to do. It's harder for an Asian to do because they're smaller. Now, I haven't anywhere said you're not going to become a captain if you're Asian. But the reality is, because Asians have a harder time on this test, they're not going to become captains. So while I haven't intentionally discriminated disparate treatment, I have unintentionally discriminated disparate impact, because the impact on a group is what leads to the outcomes, right? Hope that makes sense, because that's really kind of important. So the summary here, a disparate treatment is an action applied unequally. One group, but not the other group. I'm not going to, can't think of a great example here, but it's basically it is, I'm not going to hire you because you're a woman, right? And there are some situations where that's legitimate, but not very many. Disparate impact is unintentional. It's an action that's applied equally. Maybe disparate treatment is, you know what, because you're a man, I'm going to assume that you can climb that ladder. And I'm not going to ask you to do it. Because you're a female, I'm going to make you climb that ladder just to be sure. Well, I'm not applying the action equally. I'm applying it to one group and not the other group, okay? Disparate impact, everybody has to climb the ladder. So the action is applied equally, but it has different outcomes based on whether you're male or female. Maybe giving a college level test to see who is going to be promoted to director of marketing is applied equally. Every candidate has to take the test, but somebody who hasn't graduated college won't do as well. Now, whether you went to college or not is not a protected class or a protected group, but if we can see the outcomes, if it's more African Americans who don't pass the test than whites, whether you went to college or not is irrelevant. The protected classes related to race may enter into this. So disparate treatment, there are occasions where you don't get the job you want, you don't get the pay you want, whatever, you don't get hired because you are part of a protected class. Because I am transgender, as of the time that I record this, that's still kind of in the fuzzy whether it's part of a protected class or not. There is a movement in Congress right now to include it as a protected class. There's some executive orders that impact that, but there is no official law that says that it is right now. It's all court interpretation. But let's say that we pass a law saying that transgender, binary, all those kinds of things that I don't honestly really understand, falls under protected class. And I say, I'm not going to hire you because you're transgender. And that's just the way it is. I'm going to treat you differently. That would be, at least it was a great opportunity to make a claim of disparate treatment. But what if I said, yeah, you know what, you're transgender, whatever. I'm not going to make you do this simply because you're transgender to see. Everybody does this. Everybody takes this test. But after a little while, it starts to become obvious that transgenders do poorly on it, more so than non-transgenders. I haven't intentionally made any decisions, intentional discrimination, disparate treatment, but I might have indirectly created discrimination as a result of something that looked fair on the surface. Everybody has to take the same test, and if you came to me and said, this is not fair, you didn't promote me because I couldn't pass this test. What's not fair about that? Everybody takes this test, and the people who pass it get promoted. That's fair. Well, maybe not, if it has unintended consequences. All right, so all people take the test, but one classification passes it at a higher rate than another classification. So disparate treatment and disparate impact. If you feel like you've been discriminated against, the first thing that you need to do is do some analysis as to whether this is likely intentional or consequential. Is it disparate treatment or is it disparate impact? Did they make a decision just because of who you are, or are you part of a crowd that gets told no because there's something about that crowd that makes it difficult to do what they're asking you to do? You've got to be able to make a reasonable claim. On face value, at first glance, it looks like there could be a problem here. We would call that a prima facie, PRIMA FACIE. That's a very, very important term. Again, 3 important terms. This is almost 10 minutes long so far because it is so critical to understand the basics here. 3 critical terms: disparate treatment, disparate impact, and prima facie. Prima facie is I think, a Latin word that means on first glance or at face value. It doesn't pass the smell test, we would say. If you think you've been discriminated against, what you need to be able to say is that I want to make or establish a prima facie case of disparate treatment. I want to make a prima facie case of disparate impact. That tells the court and a lawyer, labor lawyer, an awful lot. Prima facie means I can't prove it yet, but it looks like that. Disparate treatment says they made an intentional decision. Disparate impact says they didn't make any intentional decision, but the outcome wasn't fair because I'm part of a group that doesn't do well in this situation to begin with. So that's important for the test, especially. You want to make a claim, you got to be able to establish a prima facie case of either disparate treatment or disparate impact. Okay, now let's move forward. Initially, the burden's on you if you don't get hired to prove that there's something wrong here. So the burden starts on you to be able to do what we just said, to establish a prima facie case of either disparate treatment or disparate impact. Once you can convince a lawyer or a court that there may be a problem, we don't know yet, we're going to look into it, but you've at least given us enough to think about, to explore that there might be a problem. Now the burden shifts to the employer to prove that it wasn't. So you share the burden at first, but you pass that burden off if you can do a good enough job of establishing that there might be a problem here. So let's focus for a bit here on disparate treatment. That is intentional discrimination. There's three basic categories that we can go to try to prove disparate treatment. The first is called restricted company values. Basically, this says there's a formal policy in place. For example, we're only going to hire men for this position. Now that gets to the heart of a gender issue, doesn't it? Men, women, that's gender. And if there is a policy in place, I mean, you may be able to go to a company handbook and turn to page 37. It says we'll only hire men for this job. Maybe it's not in writing, but that is the understanding. Maybe we think that there's a reason why it makes sense to only hire men. But if we have a formal policy or an informal policy that we're only going to hire men, that raises a red flag that there could be at least a prima facie case for disparate treatment based upon restricted company policy. So one thing we look for is that if this is intentional, it might be because there's a policy that says this is how we're going to act every single time it comes up. The second thing is discriminatory remarks in an interview process. Can be either oral or written. It can be a formal or an informal setting. Maybe we don't have a written policy, but some idiot who's doing the interviewing says, well, you look pretty good on paper, but you're Asian, so I'm not real sure. Ding, ding, ding there. You know what? You might have already made a conscious decision that we're not going to hire Asian people because we have found that they're not as capable over the course of the past. That's an intentional decision, though. So restricted company policy, discriminatory remarks. You can come back later and say, you didn't hire me because that guy in that interview called me an Asian and said, don't get my hopes up. It's obvious he had made up his decision. It was based upon my race. Okay? So restricted company policy, discriminatory remarks. The third is a little bit more difficult. It's called the McDonnell-Douglas test, and this one's really important for the test purposes. You have to be able to show four things, and it may be difficult. Very few companies are going to have a formal policy that we don't hire females. Very few interviewers are going to be stupid enough to say, well, if you weren't a woman, we could hire you right now. But they might do that from time to time. The McDonnell-Douglas is probably the more common defense that you throw up or accusation that you throw up as to why you didn't get hired. McDonnell-Douglas has four main parts to it, and the burden's here on you to be able to show that these four things happen. So again, initially, the burden's on the person to establish a prima facie case of disparate treatment in this case, and you do that by saying there's a restricted company policy. So the language in your lawsuit would be, I was not hired, I was discriminated against because of a prima facie case of disparate treatment as it pertains to restricted company policy. That tells the court they intentionally discriminated, that there is reasonable evidence because they have a policy in place that told them to tell you no. Or I have a prima facie case of disparate treatment on discriminatory remarks. The third one would be I'm laying out a prima facie case of disparate treatment under the McDonnell-Douglas test. So now I'm going to have to show four things. The first thing is that I am part of a protected class. You don't have to do a whole lot to prove that you're Asian or to prove that you're female or to prove that one of these classifications, right? You are indeed part of a protected class. Number two, you have to show that you applied for this job and you were qualified. And it's a little bit tougher. I mean, I can show you that I applied. Here's my application. You can find it in their files. So that's not hard to prove that you applied. You got to be able to show that you were qualified. This is what they were looking for. This is what I laid out in my interview and in my resume. On face value, I am qualified. So I'm part of a protected class. I applied and I was qualified. Then part number three, they told me no. Here's the letter that they sent me. They called me over the phone. It was on June the 12th at 4 o'clock. I'm part of a protected class. I applied. I was qualified. They told me no. And then the damning piece of evidence, part number four, is either the position remained open and they continued to look and ultimately hired somebody who is equally qualified but not part of my protected class, or it was left open indefinitely. But the whole point is they had the perfect candidate and they passed for some reason. It's obvious that they passed because of this component of who I am. They wanted somebody who's not in the class that I'm in. So McDonnell Douglas, I'm part of a protected class. I applied, I was qualified, I was rejected, and then they either left the position open when they could have had me working the whole time because I was qualified, or they filled it not long afterwards with somebody who's not part of this protected class. So I'm Asian, I'm female, I apply for a job, I'm qualified for the job, I get told no, and then a week later they hire somebody who is an awful lot like me, except it's a white guy. The only difference is the race and the gender. Those are both protected classes. So I could say, based on the McDonnell-Douglas test, it would appears there is a prima facie case of disparate treatment. Okay? So that's the disparate treatment. Now what if I want to, at 18 minutes here, what if I want to make a case that I was discriminated against? There's prima facie evidence. I want to establish a prima facie case of disparate impact. Now remember, that is unintentional. That is the unfortunate outcome of an equally applied test that's not fair. I'm not doing anything specific to you, but I'm not being fair because people that are part of your classification don't do as well on this generally as other people, even though they're qualified other than this test. So in the case of unintentional discrimination, disparate impact, the way that we would show that to establish the prima facie is by what we call the 4/5 rule. Now remember, 4/5 is 80%. There's a test question about this, and you got to make sure that this is a little bit of math here. You got to make sure that you get this math right. You understand the basis of this math. What we do in the 4/5 test, it doesn't say that because I'm a female, 80% of females, that's 4/5, have to pass. What we do for the 4/5 test is compare the pass rate of my protected class to the pass rate of a comparable protected class. So if I'm a female and I didn't get hired or I didn't get approved for this promotion, and I think it's, you gave me the same test, excuse me, you gave me the same test that you gave the guys, and I didn't pass it, but very few females pass it. So what I do for the 4/5 test is I say, okay, show me your statistics. How many guys took the test? How many passed it? Okay, 40 guys took it, 30 guys passed it. What's the success rate? The success rate is 30 out of 40, which is 75%. Okay, that becomes the standard. So we write that down. Males, we're comparing males to females here. Males pass or succeed at a 75% rate. Okay, now 20 females took that same test. If the success rate of the females is less than 80% of 75, then there is at least the appearance of disparate impact. So the math gets a little tricky here. It does not mean that 80% of females have to pass. It means that the success rate of females, or the in question classification, has to be at least 80%, if not more than, the success rate of the comparable group. So here's where you get your calculator. If the success rate of the males is 75%, you take 75% and you multiply it by 80%. What is 80% of 75? I'm going to have to get my calculator here. I'm going to tap in my little password. I'm going to type it twice because I didn't do it right the first time. I'm going to go to my calculator up here, and I'm going to type in 0.75. You can't really even, there you go up in the corner. 75% is the pass rate of the males, and I'm going to multiply by 0.8 because I know from this that the female pass rate has to be 80% of the male pass rate. So the male pass rate, success rate of 75 times the lower limit is 80%. That's the 4/5. Success rate of the comparable group times 80% to find the minimum. Right? So 75% times 80%. That says that at least 60% of females have to pass to be reasonably appropriate to the success rate of the male group. So we're going to get a piece of paper here. We're going to write some of this down. Males, we had 30 out of 40, which is 75%. There we have that. 30 out of 40 is 75%. The 80% of that, 4/5, is 60%. All right, males pass at a 75% rate. To get 4/5, we'd have to have at least 60. Let's say that 20 females took the test and 13 passed, right? So we've got 13 out of 20 females. We're going to take 13, we're going to divide by 20. That gives us 0.65. 13 divided by 20 is 0.65. Now, I may feel like 30 males passed and only 13 females passed. That's discriminatory. But the 4/5 rule says that as long as the success rate of females is at least 60% of the success rate of males, there is no unintentional discrimination. And the reality is that if 13 out of 20 females pass, 65% pass. And the 4/5 applied to the 30 out of 40 says that at least 60 have to pass. So in this case, even though only 13 females passed and 30 males passed, there is no unintentional discrimination because the success rate of the females was at least 80% of the success rate of the males. That gets really, really tricky. And it's taken 4 minutes to talk through that, but that is so, so very important. So the 4/5 rule. What you want to remember right off the bat is that the 4/5 rule is the tool that we use when we want to claim prima facie case of disparate impact. And the whole point behind it is you give everybody the same test, but one group gets hurt more. The question for the court is, do they get hurt in a big enough differential to do something about it? And the theory is that if your group succeeds at least 80% as much, as often as the other group succeeds, there's not a problem. So it really depends on all the numbers. That's why you have to get the right group to compare to. You have to get accurate records. So you're an African American, and you pass at 39%, and you're saying that Caucasians get unfair treatment unintentionally because it's easier for them to pass the test. Well, if your 39% is 80% or more of the male or the Caucasian success rate, there's no unintentional discrimination. But if the Caucasians pass at 80% and you pass at 42%, yeah, that doesn't meet the threshold of 80% of 80, which is 64. So there would be. Hope you understand that. Give me a holler if that doesn't make sense. So let's look at, if you're looking at the notes here, as we're getting longer and longer into this video with still another page of notes to go, there's an example there halfway down the second page of these notes. Let's say that 70% of the men pass this test and 40% of the women pass this test. That seems to be unfair. It's almost double. Now, does that hold up in court? Well, we would apply the 4/5 rule, because it's not something because you're female, no, because you're male, yes. You're all taking the same test. We are applying the same test equally to everybody. But are we getting different outcomes as a result of something? Maybe gender. We take our 70% of the males who pass and we multiply it by 80, which is 4/5, or really we multiply it by 0.80. So 70 times 0.80 is 0.56. That says that if 70% of males pass, at least 56% of females have to pass. Now, if we know that 40% of females pass, that's below the 56% cutoff, so that we could say, yeah, it looks like, not proof, but looks like there's a prima facie, face value, first glance case of disparate impact. We would therefore be able to go to a court and say, I want somebody to look into this and ask some questions, because it looks like there's a problem here. It looks like a duck, it smells like a duck, it quacks like a duck. Let's make sure that it is, in fact, a duck. All right? So now, that's what we as an employee do, right? We've talked about discrimination in terms of disparate treatment. We can have restricted company policy. We can have forget the terminology that I used on the last page, restricted company policy, discriminatory remarks, and the McDonnell-Douglas test. If it is disparate impact, we can show that disparate impact through the 4/5 rule. Now, if we can do one of those things, the burden shift to the employer. How does the employer defend against that? Okay, so if the claim is disparate treatment because of restricted company policy, the company says, yeah, we have a rule in our handbook. You don't even have to go subpoena the thing. I'll tell you, it's in Section 2, Policy 1-3A, and it says we're only going to hire males for this job. And the females might want to claim that's discrimination. They never had a chance. But we would say, if we have a restricted company policy, there is a BFOQ, a bona fide occupational qualification, a BFOQ. There is a reason and it is legitimate. For example, we're not going to hire a female to fill the role of a linebacker in the NFL. If you're a female, don't apply. That's discrimination. Well, there's a legitimate reason. Are there females who could be linebackers? Yeah, probably. But the population for that group is so very, very low that it's just a whole lot easier to say, no, thank you. Appreciate your interest in playing for the Dallas Cowboys, but if you're a female, you're not going to be a linebacker on our team. And that kind of makes sense. It would be easy enough in court, I think, to say, listen, you're going to be blocking 350-pound men. You're going to get flattened, right? I mean, we're not even going to accept all men for that job. You've got to be a big burly guy to be able to be a linebacker in the NFL. So that falls into the classification that all or nearly all of the people in that classification are not qualified. And it's okay to restrict the entire group if all or nearly all will not be qualified to begin with. The second way that we can defend against restricted company policy under the heading of BFOQ, bona fide occupational qualification, is the concept of authenticity. If I run a Mexican restaurant and I say, if you're not Mexican or Hispanic by descent, don't apply to be a server. That's not fair. I can serve food just as well as he can. Yeah, but if I claim to be an authentic Mexican restaurant and I have a bunch of white guys serving, you're going to come in and go, this is not Mexican. So there is a reason why I only want Hispanics out there serving, because it adds to my claim that this is an authentic Mexican restaurant. So authenticity is a defense against a company policy. We won't hire Caucasians to be servers in our Mexican restaurant. And there's a legitimate reason why. It destroys our claim of authenticity. The third thing is propriety. And that's an example perhaps of in the fancier hotels, ladies, you go into the bathroom, you do your business there, you wash your hands, and the really Ritz-Carlton type places, they've got somebody standing there with a basket full of towels, and you take that towel and you wipe off your hands. It would be very, very unrealistic. It'd be improper if there was a guy standing there in your bathroom handing you those towels. Same thing for a guy. You go into the bathroom, you go to the bathroom, you wash your hands, and there's a guy in a tuxedo standing there with a basket of towels. It'd be very uncomfortable if there was a woman standing there. So propriety would say, we're not going to hire a female to work in the men's restroom. And that's why it took so long to get female sports reporters into the locker rooms. It was not proper for a girl to go in the locker room when men were walking around taking showers. We've found ways around that. They have to wait a little while to go in. There's two sections of the locker room. They can go into the first section where people are dressed, but it's not, generally speaking, it's not proper for a female to be in this environment or for a male to be in this environment. You might argue that propriety would come into place if we don't want to hire males as servers for Hooters waitresses because of the outfits. That doesn't make sense. The last category, all or nearly all are unqualified, authenticity, propriety, or safety. Can't come up with a good excuse right now or a reason right now, but there are certain occupations where it's just not safe to have a particular class filling that role. And like I said, I can't come up with one right off, but hypothetically, if you're dealing with, maybe we could say like a power company lineman. It's like it's not safe for females to be up there working with heavy wires and live electricity. I mean, that's really not legitimate anymore, but maybe something like that. So again, disparate treatment. Restricted company policy, we can defend with a BFOQ, a bona fide occupational qualification. Make sure that you only use BFOQ if we're talking about restricted company policy. All or nearly all are not qualified. Authenticity forces us to do this, propriety forces us to do this, or safety forces us to do this. Now, if you, the employee, have sued for discrimination under a prima facie case of disparate treatment under discriminatory remarks, he said, you're a female, you're out of luck. Because you're Hispanic, you don't expect a whole lot. The way that we would defend against that as a company is really one of two things. To either say, seriously, what that person said to you was not really that bad. You're taking it out of context. You're blowing it up into something it's not. It's not really that bad. The remark really wasn't all that bad. And you know what? That's in the eyes of the beholder. The fact that he said you're a female and you probably won't be able to do this job might, to me, might not be such a big deal. To you, it might. The way we would probably defend against discriminatory remarks is to say, listen, I agree with you that Mr. Jenkins over there said, sweetheart, I'd love to hire you, but since you're a female, don't get your hopes up. He never should have said that, and we agree with that. But Mr. Johnson was just an intermediate interview. He suggested some names, but he didn't make the decision. It was Mrs. Jordan that made the decision. And so the comment that Mr. Jenkins made in your interview had no bearing on the decision that Mrs. Jordan made. So we would say that the person who made the remark wasn't part of the hiring process. So maybe they're a filter in the process. And the fact that they didn't push your name forward doesn't mean that you were excluded, because there were other people who interviewed you that did push your name forward. So the fact that he made a comment because he wasn't part of the decision-making process wasn't ultimately what killed your hiring. So that's a little bit harder to do, but there are a couple of ways to do it. McDonnell Douglas, you remember, I'm part of a protected class. I applied, I was qualified, I was rejected, and then either the position remained open or they hired somebody who's not part of my protected class. How do we defend against that? We show legitimate reasons why they weren't hired. Yeah, you're part of a protected class. Yeah, you applied, and yeah, you were qualified. Yeah, we rejected you, and yeah, we hired somebody else who's not part of your class. But it's not because of the class you were part of. It's because of something that you were missing. You weren't as qualified as you thought. Now, remember, in hiring, it's not about, ultimately, in a perfect world, it's not about hiring somebody who's 100% qualified, because they're not out there. You may think you're 90% qualified, but the 10% you're missing in our estimation was the important 10%. And somebody else had that 10%. So even though you think you were qualified, and we would agree that you were probably fairly qualified, you weren't qualified enough, and somebody else was. That's how you defend against McDonnell Douglas. Okay? Legitimate reasons. You don't have an education degree. You can do all of these things, but it's required that you have an education degree. And this person has an education degree. That's a legitimate reason. So that's all of the defenses against disparate treatment. 36 minutes here. I am so sorry. I wish there was a great way to really break this up into a couple of videos, but the way they wrote the book and how they interlap with each other, it's kind of hard to do that. You make a case of prima facie case of disparate impact, and you use the 4/5 rule to do that. How do you defend against that? Yeah, it's true that less than 80%. When we look at the success rate of your group, it's less than 80% of the success rate of that group. The 4/5 rule applies here. Yeah, we don't question that. Your math is right. The numbers are right. The 4/5 rule seems to indicate that you're getting the raw end of the deal through no intentional process whatsoever, but as the unfortunate outcome or consequence of a rule that we apply to everybody. How do I defend against the 4/5 rule? The phrase that I use is business necessity. This gets a little bit complicated here because we had bona fide occupational qualification under restricted company policy. Under McDonnell Douglas, we have legitimate reasons why we came to this decision. Under disparate impact, we use the phrase business necessity. In other words, this particular qualification or test that your group doesn't do as well on as another group proportionally is critical to success in this job. For example, go back to that fireman thing. It is critical that you be able to do this job. You be able to climb this ladder with all this stuff on your back. You be able to pick up somebody and climb back out. I'm sorry that females do that successfily at 70% of the time, and males do it successfully 99% of the time, and the difference is not 80% or greater. I'm sorry about that. But if you can't carry 40 pounds of gear, get up this ladder in under 10 seconds, and get out with a child on your back, you can't be successful in this job. And the fact that females can't do that as proportionally successfully as men do, it can't factor into this. It is a necessity that you be able to do this thing. That's a lot of information. There's some really, really big ideas in there that apply to this test, such as the 4/5 rule. You go in now expecting to have to calculate a 4/5 rule. And I got to make sure that I tell the Proctor people that you can have a 4-function calculator and a piece of paper and a pencil so that you can scratch some numbers down. But you need to be able to calculate the 4/5 rule. You need to be able to understand what numbers you're comparing to each other, and you need to understand the language that you would use. Prima facie case of disparate impact using the 4/5 rule, whatever the case may be. And then you need to be able to explain that you defend it with business as necessity. You also need to understand the McDonnell Douglas and what the 4 things are. You need to understand that if I am making a claim using McDonnell Douglas, it's going to be a prima facie case of disparate treatment because it's a conscious decision, and it either comes down to restricted company policy, or it comes down to improper, what the words were that I used in there, improper comments, discriminatory remarks, or it comes down to McDonnell Douglas. If it's McDonnell Douglas, I got to be able to show 4 things. All right. If it's restricted company policy, I need to be able to show a BFOQ, and it falls under one of those categories. If it's discriminatory remarks, I need to be able to show that it really wasn't all that bad. You're taking it out of, blowing it out of proportion, or that that person did not have a vote, and it wasn't his vote that killed you. Or with McDonnell Douglas, that there is a legitimate reason, and be able to point out what that reason was. All right. Boy, that's an awful lot of material here. I would suggest that, as unfortunate as it sounds, that you watch this 40-minute video a couple of times, that you read that section of the book a lot, because there is a tremendous amount of material in this one little section of the book that can make you or break you as an HR person or as a manager. And we'll leave it at that for now at 40 minutes long. Hopefully this is the longest video that I'm going to do, just simply because the way the book breaks up the material, and there wasn't a good way to multi-section this thing into separate, smaller videos. Sorry for the length. Hope you learned a lot.